Hello, welcome to this evening's Wheaton Conversation with Beth Lipman and Erica Rosenfeld. My name is Marcy Peterson. WheatonArts is thrilled to celebrate its 50th anniversary as one of the most unusual and creative landmarks in the Northeast. Founded by glass magnate Frank H. Wheaton Jr., the first WheatonArts buildings opened to the public in 1970. 50 years later, WheatonArts has become an international hub for artists exploring the limits of their creativity and a reception for the region's cultural diversity. It has additionally earned regional, national, and international recognition for its unique collections and programs. Wheaton Conversations continue in 2021. Engage with us through the winter with this virtual series highlighting select and diverse artists with ties to WheatonArts. There are three main ways to support WheatonArts. They are membership, donations, and shopping at shop.wheatonarts.org. Please contact Rudy Barron, Director of Development, if you would like more information or to discuss the different types of giving support to WheatonArts. My co-worker, Pamela Weichman, is Director of Education and Artist Services at WheatonArts. This evening, she will moderate the questions you ask in the Q&A window. So don't be shy, ask your questions. Over to you, Pam.
Marcy, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everybody. It is my pleasure to be here with you and to introduce our guests. Our first guest tonight is Beth Lipman. Beth is an American artist whose sculptural practice explores aspects of material culture and deep time through still lives, site-specific installations, and photographs. Ephemeral and intricate, her work addresses mortality, immateriality, and temporality, critical issues since the inception of the still life tradition in the 17th century that continue to be relevant. Our second guest tonight is Erica Rosenfeld. Embracing the cultural histories of glassmaking, cooking, and crafting, Erica Rosenfeld's work celebrates community-centric, obsessive, labor-intensive ritual. Her hybrid artistic practice has centered on the performative, sculptural, and social aspects of glassmaking and food making. Her current body of work, Revere Forest, Sanctuary for Strange Creatures, investigates mid-century phenomenon, paint by numbers, as cultural artifacts of the early 1950s in America. She is also the co-founder of the performance collective, the Burnt Asphalt Family, with whom she has performed throughout the United States. I would like to thank you all again for tuning in. Please remember to subscribe to the WheatonArts YouTube channel and make sure to click the bell to receive notifications when future videos are posted. Erica and Beth, thank you so much for being with us here tonight. I'm very excited to talk with you.
And I think that there are so many artists that actually share that that kind of debt to WheatonArts. So incredible place, and we can't wait until post-pandemic to come back and spend a long time and rub shoulders with everyone. I also want to thank Erica Rosenfeld for being in this conversation with me. Your talent, your generosity, your humor are deeply inspiring. I follow your work closely, every new body of work, and I'm really honored to be in this conversation with you. So how we're going to format this tonight is we're going to take 4 sections and start with studio practice. I'm going to briefly introduce my work. Erica will do the same. And we're just going to launch right into asking each other questions, since this is a conversation after all. So it'll be my studio practice first, then Erica's, then some collaborative and response work I've done, and then Erica's collaborative work as well. So just to give you a heads up that we're not going to be describing every single image that you see on your screen. I would also like to acknowledge that this visit is being held on the traditional lands of the Chippewa, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Winnebago, and Menominee people where I am, and pay my respects to elders both past and present. So where am I? I am in Sheboygan Falls, Wisconsin, which you saw in the previous slide. We're about an hour north of Milwaukee. And my studio is right behind my house, about 10 steps behind my front door. I use this studio for research, for prototyping components, for the majority of fabrication, but I also work with industry, and I work with an assortment of other artists to fabricate components. So while the majority of the work happens directly in my own studio, I'm also very much engaged in other aspects of multiple communities, whether it's industry or other shops. I also am deeply indebted to residencies like the CGCA, Wheaton Arts and Cultural Center residencies, and others. They have come at really incredible times of transition in my practice, and each have given me separate kind of points of illumination in my practice. So in terms of my sculptural practice, as Pam mentioned, it explores aspects of material culture in deep time through still lives, as you see here, site-specific installations many times, photographs, videos. I really am striving to understand the human condition and our belief systems, how our belief systems change over time, and our identity by examining other points in history and the points that we find the point of time that we find ourselves in now. So the works I consider to be portraits of society and individuals using domestic objects and interiors. Sometimes they manifest in immersive, very site-specific installations. They're usually quite immersive, even though margin for error is a bit minimal, as you see here. And oftentimes they juxtapose cultural objects with expressions of wilderness. And many times when I say wilderness, it's like our perceived notions of what wilderness is. And lately I've been very focused on what maybe prehistoric landscapes might look like, and using that as a point in time that is prehistoric to humans. The large-scale work is built with a multitude of components, primarily out of glass, also wood. I've recently introduced some clay, and I also work in metal photography and video. Furniture usually plays a part in my work in one way or another. All of the installations, almost all of them, incorporate a table, but I also work, as you saw in a previous image, with other aspects of furniture. And the furniture to me not only refers to the human body and the utility by the body, but it becomes an allegory of the body many times. So those are just like a few of the concerns that drive my practice. I don't know if you can see me, Erica, but I'm smiling.
Okay, it's time for your first question. So in getting ready for this talk, I've been thinking a lot about the themes in your work and how they're so timeless and so relevant to today's cultural climate. As much of it talks about materiality, mortality, and impermanence. Can you think of which objects you might choose to turn into historical artifacts to activate from society today, and why?
So I do think in some ways all objects are fodder for they are automatically go into this category of historical artifact, right? And what I vacillate with, though, and consider often is my agency surrounding certain artifacts or certain objects, whether or not they fall within a wheelhouse that I would have permission on some level to use, and also are they universal from like a Western canon perspective. I have drastically veered away from any of the most recent technology because I'm just not sure where that's going to fall. They are all obviously obsolete immediately, just like my iPhone 8 that I turned in. So, you know, I mean, I think that all of the things that we make become detritus that talks about us, really.
Okay. Um, Next question. I can imagine that your investigations into the 17th century still life for your artwork and your fascination with material culture must have been a response to the world around you at the time you began making the work. What do you think you were initially responding to?
So I made my first still life, the first direct still life, when I was living in New York City in the 90s. And at that time, I just, and I realized that this is a very, in some ways, like urban predicament in some ways, but the landscape, the urban landscape, of course, we know about the skyscrapers, the architecture, and the way that you define your space in this interior exterior way, but so much of it is about capitalism in in New York City. So for me, it was very much about like desiring things every single day, and then like strategizing my mind whether or not I could afford them, what my relationship was to that storefront, whether I like what those things represented in terms of who could take ownership over them. And I started thinking about what was previously known as the Dutch Golden Era and these kind of parallels between that like economic boom, really massive shift in the way that we think about commodity, we think about food and commodity, and how that defines us. So that was really the impetus for working in the still life tradition, and is that like really economic and capitalist kind of parallels between the Dutch Golden Era and the time that I was living there in the early O's and late 90s.
Yeah. Okay. So as families, as communities, we often create a shared folklore to memorialize people, places, and events. And I feel like your work really does this for the viewer. I think that this way of thinking leads us to create personal mythologies, to contextualize our past, define the present, and imagine our future. Do you think your work touches on your personal mythology, or are you solely responding to society at large?
I think
also maybe we want to pause on this picture, Beth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can we do that, Pam and Marcy? We can pause on House Album. Yeah, on the previous.
Yeah,
the one that
two ago.
Yeah, if we pause here, because we're going to talk about this piece as well. So I think that as an artist, I can just speak, I guess, from my own perspective, but I do strive to communicate to a broad audience, kind of about these very universal themes. So I'm looking for something that, or have incorporated a vocabulary that really is something that I think at least like people that participate within the civic life of the United States might recognize or be able to relate to in some way, and then have it kind of puddle out from there. But I think ultimately, and I'm curious about what you think about this as well, Erica, but like ultimately it all does come back to the personal, whether or not your intention was there to begin with or not. Like, you almost can get sideswiped sometimes and realize how deeply personal or like that you're coming from a place of vulnerability or a place of like something that you desperately need to work out, but you weren't aware of it when you were thinking kind of in this broader umbrella way, and then it becomes very personal at the same time. And I find that unknown quality is really something that continues to drive my work.
Yeah. Okay, so about this piece, this is a time-based piece called House Album. And in this piece, as well as others, kind of makes me think about the idea that there are spiritual and physical things that people cling to in order to find and define their identity. as well as the fact that there's always a range of stories with material association. So do you consider the activity of scrapbooking an act of defining oneself in the world around them, as well as telling a story about their life?
I think it's constantly a way that we define ourselves and think about. I mean, it's interesting. So the whole genesis of this idea came from Victorian scrapbooking, which I think we can take the next slide now and hold there, Pam and Marcy. Yeah. So on the right, you'll see the Victorian, like this is an example from the Wheaton Museum of a Victorian house book, basically. And so, you know, in much the same way that young women and children created their own realities at that time and allowed themselves to kind of figure out a way to interpret and process this onslaught of new images in their life. It was it was a time where the printing press became prolific and there was an abundance of images. And it was a way that they could sort and process and fantasize and play with their environments and their perceived desires within that environment. So I took that understanding and I really, I started applying it to what I, my perceived like wishes for what the United States looks like. And how our civic life would look if I allowed myself to fantasize about what it meant to be a United States citizen outside of the context of what it is, actually. And so I started using this concept of scrapbooking to bring together conceptually an understanding of some of the parts of our history that I would like to take ownership over. And I think that there's other ways that we do this. And I have a feeling that you might do it in your work as well, Erica, in a different way. This kind of amassing of things to redefine who you are and also through your environment and that kind of give and take. I don't know. Does that sound like something?
I feel like that's one of the things I connect with in your work the most, for sure.
Yeah. We can. Okay. So anyway, so that's it is your turn, Erica.
Yeah, it's my turn. So thank you to everyone who came today. Thank you to Susan for thinking of and asking us to do this talk today, and to Marcy and Pam for facilitating it and spending so much time with us leading up to the talk. I'd also like to say that my first of 3 residencies at WheatonArts was the most pivotal experience that I've had as an artist, and that it truly changed the course of my life. And it also taught me that when you need something to change your life, it can. And I have so much gratitude for the organization and am forever grateful for all the resources that the people there have given me, including Hank Murda Adams and Susan Gogan. And as for my old friend and talking partner, it's really an honor to have been asked to do this with Beth today. A year after starting to use glass in my work, I TA'd an 8-week class for Beth at Urban Glass almost 20 years ago. We were a lot younger.
Crazy.
Although it was short, it had a really big impact on the way I approach glass as a material and how I approach the glass world. Since I didn't go to school for the medium, my education was experiential learning. So getting to watch Beth teach for 2 months was pretty priceless. And watching such a talented and smart artist push the boundaries of glass and manage to find new applications for very traditional glass processes was inspiring, and a way of working that really resonated to me. And then one more thing, also entering the glass studio at the time as a young person was pretty intimidating. So working with such a warm and generous woman made me feel really comfortable. And her encouragement really allowed me to picture myself having a career in glass. So thank you. And I also think it's pretty wonderful that Beth chooses to acknowledge the Indigenous people that inhabited our spaces before us in all of her lectures and talks. She suggested that we do this today, so I would like to acknowledge that this visit is being held on the traditional lands of the Lenape, Canarsie, and Rockaway people, and pay my respect to elders both past and present. So just to get into my work, in my art and design practice, I have 3 different bodies of work, including installations, like this one, that are comprised of discrete objects, including sculptures and 2-dimensional works, as well as performative and interactive art. And I also have a line of limited edition jewelry. And although these 3 bodies are very different in many ways, I think that the thread that ties my artwork and my jewelry together is my love of ritual and obsessive and labor-intensive processes. And I think that what hovers over both of my art practices is my love of constructing environments, transforming spaces, and creating experiences for people that might transport them a little. So most of the images rolling right now are, except for the first 2, are my most recent work, which was for a show at the Heller Gallery in New York in the fall of 2019. I missed 2019. It was called Reverie Forest, Sanctuary for Strange Creatures. And some of the work is also things that I finished this year. And the work explores the culture of the post-war era in America and investigates themes of conformity, othering, mass culture, and widespread fear. I began the work in early 2017 when our country changed a lot, to say the least. And at the time, I found that there were some glaring similarities to the political climate of the early 1950s. And simultaneously, I had been reading about the history of the mid-century modern phenomenon, paint by numbers, and noticed that the paintings really painted a picture of idealized life at the time. And I began to see them as cultural artifacts from that period. So the imagery included dream vacation scenes, unfamiliar cultures, European art, adorable animals, and basically a sugar-coated reality. And I see these paintings as a window into the culture of the early 1950s in America, and represented people's fears of coloring out of the lines while they painted brushstrokes onto miscellaneous numbered dictated shapes, all by rote. And I became fascinated by the fact that paint by numbers was invented the same year as McCarthyism and the House of Un-American Activities was born. And much like the last 4 years, there was a political system that couldn't tolerate opposition. And we had a government that recklessly preyed on people's hatred for outsiders, fear of losing their free will and freedoms, and therefore managed to sow division and widespread panic, instilling maybe a need for people to find safety and order that these painting kits seem to provide. So I decided to begin appropriating imagery from the vintage paintings and collaged and painted it together, which is what you see here, into original works to kind of change the context of the subjects. I also embellished the paintings with glass lenses, blown glass, and found objects. And I used the forest as a backdrop for the characters and focused on transforming the images of adorable animals into beautiful mutants and strange creatures and the pastoral landscapes and to peculiar habitats to kind of give them a new life where their new perceived freakishness would no longer exist, as they had found a safe zone in the Reverie Forest where they can live outside of the constraints of societal pressures to fit into the prescribed norm. I'm smiling.
Yeah, are you ready for a question?
Yeah.
So Erica, I have just like a general question about your practice. Do you have rituals or habits that shape your studio practice? What does your time in your studio look like? Do you listen to music? what time of day do you prefer? I had the great fortune of seeing your studio not too many years ago, and it really does make me more curious about what your day-to-day experience is.
Well, I really love this question because I feel like the way in which I live my life is a really important part of and intertwined in my art practice. I think that a lot of art is born from how artists respond to life, and that the rituals and traditions that we choose to partake in and give weight to have great bearing on how we make work. So I spend a lot of time at Urban Glass in Brooklyn to make my glass components, and it's also a pretty social place for me. I'm a pretty social person. And I also spend a lot of time in my studio at home. And for a long time, my studio at home was sandwiched in between my garden and my kitchen. So I was constantly moving throughout the three spaces and working on different projects. And although I've moved it, I find myself continuing those habits of taking intermittent breaks to cook or garden or tend to my houseplants, walk my dog. So and do a lot of domestic rituals while I'm working and listen to a lot of music, usually 60s soul and 90s hip hop. I find it very motivating.
Nice. I do too.
I figured you did.
I think that's common for people
Yeah.
working in glass, actually.
I think so.
Your work invites the audience to inhabit a liminal space. It references the natural world, but is constructed with overtly artificial components. Can you talk more about this in-between space? And do you think that your work deals with the desire to find an allegorical safe place or a place of belonging? I mean, you referenced that before with the most recent body of work, that you're looking for a home for these hybrid animals.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that my work deals with the desire to find an allegorical safe space. It's something I've sought after throughout my whole life since childhood. And I've also always been a collector and a self-proclaimed hoarder. So it's really hard for me to let go of things and people in life. And I find myself constantly gathering objects and humans and sometimes dogs, maybe to feel safe. I also love to create environments that might make people feel safe and kind of like an intimate space or something that's magical. And I recently dismantled the room you're talking about, which was a giant shrine that I spent 12 years building in my house. And it was a pretty immersive space made from amassing, cataloging, and reorganizing all of the collections in my life. There were thousands of objects, vintage and new photographs, drawings, food. I would save under bell jars that had sentimental value, gifts from friends, and mostly artificial components, but when installed together, almost felt to me to be a natural environment, almost like my Eden, you know, and it was a protective space and kept me surrounded by my art physically and emotionally. And that bled into my artwork, definitely, that I show. It used to just be my art for myself. Now it's what I show.
All right, I'm going to ask you a question that shows you like how this is kind of where my head's at when I look at some of your work. But I've recently taken a deep dive into the Overstory by Richard Powers. Amazing book, if any of you are looking for a good read. One of the characters is based on the real life of Suzanne Simard and her groundbreaking work on mycorrhizal networks that illuminates interspecies cooperation that allows everything to thrive in a forest. And when I look at your work, I just think about, I mean, you know, I recently read that, but it kind of, in some ways, recontextualized your installations for me. Like it really kind of blew them up to this other level. And I just wondered if you had read the book or you were familiar with her research. at all.
Well, I hadn't read it, but I remembered you had mentioned it at some point. And the idea of interspecies cooperation, allowing things to thrive, definitely resounds for me. But I've been most drawn to thinking about forests described in folklore and myth. And they, I guess, the way that they're described is that they symbolize many dualities in life. Forests can be a place of danger and asylum, wild and calm, eerie and familiar, earthly and spiritual, and deadly and beautiful simultaneously. And all of these dichotomies kind of create an unknown magical environment that can lead its inhabitants into very transformative places.
Mm. Mm.
And
So Erica, I do have one more question for you. Should we go back to the previous slide? Because I think this one's really important in your work. We're doing okay on time? Oh, great, thanks. I do want to ask you what role play has in your practice.
I'm glad you asked that. Play plays a big role in my process and my practice. Sometimes I feel like there's a misconception amongst artists who show their work that we need to only be cerebral in order to be taken seriously in our profession. And I'm a firm believer in research and doing reading that pertains to our work. But I always begin with play the way I did when I made art as a kid. I love playing and experimenting with new materials, playing with glass components, playing with friends in the studio, and it's almost a way of sketching out my ideas. I'm not a great drawer, and that's my form of sketching. And I think it also helps let go of inhibitions and be less focused on outside expectation, which in turn helps us evolve as artists. I'm not going to go on because I think we should move on to your work.
Okay. To be continued, to be continued. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some very specific ways of working that run parallel to my overreaching studio practice. So I do work in a collaborative way with others, but for the last 10 years, the majority of the work that I've done is really rooted in like a response activation experience. So this work, which you will see coming up in the next 10 slides or so, is used to create possible narratives through objects as surrogates for individuals or institutions. And can we go to the next slide, or because it'll make more sense. Okay, this is Benkechev, and I want to start here because this is the first installation that really broke open the way that I was working with others. And this happened at Wheaton Arts and Cultural Center and was made possible by Wheaton Arts and Cultural Center. So I am forever indebted to this experience of making. In 2002, I created Benkechev with 15 people of various skills, some of which were experts in working in hot glass, and others had never touched the material before. I gave them parameters, which were basically photocopies of objects that I wanted them to try to create, regardless of their skill level. And then I said that they had 2 or 3 options to try to make this piece, which basically limited their ability to really identify with their skill within the process of making. And if it fell on the ground, it was still annealed and it was still used. So it was the beginning of a way to work that was kind of limiting the identification with the craft so much. And it was more about the process of making a mark, the first mark, best mark, essentially. This is Glimmering Gone, which followed in 2007. I worked with Swedish artist, Inga-Lena Clonell, who is absolutely an amazing, amazing force and visionary. And we came together to create a multi-part installation at the Museum of Glass and with the Museum of Glass through a residency, but then also in our respective studios. And the work culminated at the museum in, I think it was installed in 2010, finally. So anyway, that was a direct collaboration with another artist. And I don't often work in that way, but the collaboration comes in these smaller moments where I'm suggesting or hiring at times people to do certain parts of the work, and I give them wide leeway to interpret what I mean, and I'm really, really interested in discovering what comes from them, which is something I could never replicate. So anyway, for over a decade, the work has been quite site responsive. It activates specific history of objects, individuals, and institutions. The installations are many times really providing a conceptual bridge between a multitude of disciplines, such as a natural or cultural system, individual histories, contemporary events, and contemporary cultural discourse. This piece and another piece called One Portrait of One Man, this is Secretary with Chipmunk, actually incorporates original works of art within the installation. And the original becomes recontextualized, or in some cases reincarnated into a different thing. So this is from the Chipstone Foundation, Secretary with Chipmunk. The last two images that you'll see are of a work that is continuing to be installed at this very moment. It's called Wild Matter, and it's an artist-made washroom for John Michael Kohler Art Center's new Art Preserve building. And it is basically an installation that calls attention to the time that we're living in now, this time of radical change because of climate change, and also like we are basically living through the 6th mass extinction of species. And every tile is different within this particular installation, and it's over 1,200 flora that is found in Southeast Wisconsin. And then there's also specimen sheets that you discover when you're using the the toilet. There's specimen sheets that illuminate that are of extirpated or extinct flora that that until very recently was found in this area. So it's kind of general concerns for a lot of the site responsive work that I do. And I'm smiling, but you can't see it.
Me too. Can you elaborate on how your collaborative work relates to your response work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to make the distinction because the collaborative work with Inga-Lena was a true joining of minds and bodies from the genesis of an idea through the final installation of Glimmering Gone. And that was a really, really powerful kind of learning experience in terms of a way of like negotiating every single step of a creative practice. And I did really enjoy it and learn a lot from it. The way that the response work kind of differs is that it does have collaborative moments of dialogue. This is the One Portrait of One Man that I had mentioned that actually has Marsden Hartley's painting in it. But anyway, the response work comes about through dialogue, which is a form of collaboration, and some of the response work really anchors itself in that dialogue more than others. but it is my response to that particular circumstance. So it can be a group think at times, but ultimately is more directed by
Right.
my interests, really,
Right. Well, I'm really interested in what is the overall methodology for approaching working with individuals and or institutions.
So typically what happens is I'm contacted by an individual or an institution and asked if I would be interested in creating a work that is site specific or is responsive to that particular location. And I usually do a site visit, and I do a fair amount of research, and a lot of that research happens on site, but depending upon timing, also because I have children, which we'll talk about shortly, I think. Some of the research takes place after I get back to the studio. And then I usually know within that first visit, it just becomes very, very clear and apparent what the direction should be in terms of a way of posing questions that would be relevant to that person or that place. And then I create a proposal, and then there is a dialogue that happens from that proposal, and things kind of unfold from there.
So
These are
intuition.
the,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
I was
I
just,
was going to say, these are the wild matter photos that you're looking at.
oh, this is
Yeah.
sounds like intuition plays a really big part in that. Once
I have to say, I rely on intuition,
Yeah.
like every time. Not every time, but I don't really know what's going to happen before I visit a site. I might know about the site, there's varying degrees in which I might be familiar with the institution or the person. And there are these like moments of doubt that happen where, I think, is this going to be the time where I'm just not inspired at all by anything? Can we go back? And I'll just, we're just gonna finish, yeah. But I think that as time goes on, like I have a lot more confidence about, and I trust that something will rise to the surface, but it just takes time, and you don't know whether it's going to be immediate or if it's going to be something that is some of these projects I've worked on for 7 years before they actually culminated in something, and
Right.
some were rather quick. So
yeah, I hear you. Okay, so this is my last question. It's rare that I meet artists who are mothers that are able to maintain their art practice in the way in which they did before they had children. And I've often thought about how you've kind of shattered this idea for me. Maybe I'm projecting. How do you maintain your prolificity as an artist and have your daughters become part of your practice? And what does your day look like doing those things simultaneously? Because I know I'm just from talking to you on the phone all week. I mean, they're involved. They're very involved, and you work hard. So I want to know how you do it.
As Amy Schwartz has said in the past, and I will never forget this, I compartmentalize a great deal. So when I am in the studio, I can really, and I think this is the great thing about having a space that's just right behind my house, but separated from my house. When I've trained myself like Pavlovian response. When I come into the studio, I am just like automatically in that space of that studio practice. And then when I walk out, I mean, sometimes it's a little harder, but I have these bigger moments of research and illumination and like, aha moments. And then I have the rest of the time, which is about making sure the kilns are constantly firing in the studio every morning. It's the first thing I do is go into my shop and make sure that I just put stuff in the kiln. And usually I know exactly what I'm putting in the kiln because I'm working towards a project.
Right.
So there's like these very like manual things that happen that keep, or I glue things. So I will say during the pandemic, my studio practice has really shrunk in terms of the time because they are virtually learning from home.
Right.
And so these like windows that I carved around their education, as many people have discovered, has just like been blown right out of the water. But in terms of their influence in the work, I have to, like, I didn't plan on being a mom, but now of course it's the best thing in my whole life. And I've learned so much about actually like life process and creative practice from the experience of being a mother and from them. So I am inspired by them and the way that they see the world and the way they think about things. And I'm grateful for that.
I bet you're inspiring to them too. I could tell when we were on Zoom the other
Well,
day.
they're tweening, so less inspiring now, for sure.
Probably. Okay.
So yeah.
Okay. So I'm just going to go into my collaborative work a little bit. The Burnt Asphalt Family is an artist collective that was co-founded in 2007 at WheatonArts. During a fellowship I received along with Jessica Jane Julius, Marette Sarapu, and Sarah Gilbert. And we were all very inspired by one another and the studio environment there. And we all lived there together with two assistants, one of whom is Skitch Mannion, who runs the studio at Wheaton now. And we also shared a studio with Sam Gear, who was there at the time. And this was also during Hank Murda Adams' tenure as artistic director there, whose outsider approach to making art and glass had a big impact on many of us, the fellows and the assistants. And as fellows, one of the requirements was to do a joint demonstration for the public. So the four of us, along with Skitch and Sam, decided to dress up like 1950s housewives and male family members and try to cook a turkey dinner using hot glass for the audience. And without thinking about it, the demo kind of organically turned into a performance, something that Hank had been doing for years before, and I think that influenced us tremendously. After the residency was over, we decided to continue our work together, and friends from the Brooklyn and Philadelphia glass communities joined. Most impactfully at the time was Emma Solomon, who became a co-curator with Jess and myself, and Deborah Teresco joined 13 years ago, who's been a major presence in it. And then we turned into an artist collective that started exploring different post-war era rituals that were meant to bring families together. And the first few shows included barbecue, cocktail party, TV dinner, and we would cook food using molten hot glass sculpted cooking tools that we almost considered to be ephemeral sculptures. And we also made mixed media kinetic sculptures to cook food for anywhere from 50 to 180 people at our events. And we don't really consider a piece finished until the audience eats our food. And we were thinking about gender roles, consumer culture, society moving away from the handmade, and really the meaning of family and chosen family, and also incorporating color into a seemingly black and white culture of the 1950s in America. And we don't consider ourselves housewives anymore, just a family of friends and artists that support each other through working together, teaching together, close friendships, and sharing resources. And the family's since grown to over 30 members. And we've hosted events at various institutions, including WheatonArts, Urban Glass, the studio at the Corning Museum, Chrysler Museum, Pilchuck, and then various universities. And Emma and Jess and I curate them, and the group's made up of artists and designers, fabricators, chefs, educators, students, and we've all sort of been brought together by a common interest and love of glass and community-centric artwork. And through hosting events using glass and food, we strive to make participatory art that almost becomes a hybrid of a performance art, installation art, dinner party, and a happening. We've also tried to focus on breaking down the barrier between the maker and the viewer, something that always felt kind of segregated for us during a glassblowing demonstration. And we hope that people might, when they see our shows, question their ideas of craft, entertainment, social values, and consumerism. We've also been exploring the idea that both food and glass can talk about history, crossing cultures, memory, desire, ritual, tradition, art, craft, and design. And we're almost trying to find an intersection between all these things. And for a long time, our work really just focused on these hot glass shows. And now we're more excited about making participatory art. And we've also recently been focusing on facilitating art raffles of family members' work and other friends to raise money for social justice organizations, including the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and for Fair Fight Action. So important right now, Fair Fight Action. And one of our next one is for No Kid Hungry. So if you ever want to know about that, reach out.
Great. Maybe can we post links to that, Erica?
Yeah,
I
can do that.
We can do that. Okay. Can you talk about the intersection of domesticity and tradition and non-traditional processes of glassworking? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, because there are a lot of similarities. Well, much of our work has compared the kitchen and the studio most as places to create a family space where a collective labor is being performed. And we think of the glass studio and the shared meal as metaphors for community, and that who sits around your dinner table and the glass studio are sort of markers of who your friends and family are, and therefore both give a sense of home. I've often thought about how the restaurant kitchen as well as the glass studio are pretty analogous, and team cooking and team glassblowing. It's almost like a dance and a choreography, but also really highlight the fact that everyone is essential to the team. And if one person's missing, the work would be really different. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because I think about it also, especially because you kind of centered it in like the 1950s culture that, like, to me, that's very like engendered, right? Where not everyone is in the kitchen necessarily doing the cooking. So I think that's interesting. And then of course, like I always think about the carving, you know, the ceremonial carving of the bird at Thanksgiving, and how that becomes more of a man's role, or used to be more of a man's role historically. So it's like, it is interesting. Like it's a.
Well, we were thinking about that when one time we realized it was all women at the bench, which we were, you know, there are 5 benches going and everyone's a woman. That was unusual to see.
Do you feel like gender, are you constantly thinking about that in terms of gender within your presentation? Is that something that you, or is it just something that kind of comes naturally?
Yeah, I think it just came naturally. And I think being 4 women put together on a fellowship, it was just sort of inherently thought about, you know, in a male populated studio at Wheaton, that was sort of the deal at first, you know.
Can you talk more about what you've learned from your collaborative experience and how that's informed your studio practice?
Yeah.
Or has it informed your studio practice?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the most beautiful things to me that I've learned through our work together about collaboration is the idea that you have to let go of ego and ownership over an idea. And since Jess, Emma, and I are curating our shows, we come up with the initial concept and tell other family members so that they can respond and react. And some go off on their own tangents, some want more guidance. Also, a lot of the time, Jess and I will not only collaborate on concept, but also on the sculptures and installations. Like this one was a total collaboration for our shows. And a lot of the time, one person will blurt out an idea and the other one will respond and add to it. And it becomes like this very organic dialogue where an idea morphs and changes according to the ideas. I can imagine it's similar with you and Ingalena. And because Jess and I have been collaborating and in our art practice and teaching for almost 14 years, we often know what the other one was thinking. This was a piece we made where Jess cast using that traditional Italian raspberry stamp, and she made black raspberry glass, and we put real blackberries, and I baked this was for Urban Glass's birthday, one of these images, and I baked 40 red velvet cakes, and those are LED lights I made out of candy gummy cherries. So we ask each other.
Delicious.
Well, it was delicious.
Sounds delicious.
The cakes were good. Yeah, it sometimes feels like your brains are welded together in a way, and but I definitely think that burnt asphalt, the work in burnt asphalt affects our own practices, but more so that everybody's own practices affect burnt asphalt. Burnt asphalt.
I definitely think more like I have tremendous respect for ongoing collaborations because I think that when you put, multiple bodies in a room, that just unexpected things can happen and doorways can open. It's like the dam bursting and then the river goes in a different direction that you couldn't have even fathomed before, right?
Exactly. And anything could happen because, I've heard about teams of artists that would almost rather sort of debate and fight through the work, and that result might be something incredible, but it's more of a push-pull thing. I think for us, it gives us, where it's more about, it's less about that, but I get it. I get why that works. But yeah, collaboration is pretty amazing.
Thank you. Are we ready for questions, Erica?
Yeah.
Is it possible? Is it just me? I feel like I might be a novice at this, but I cannot see my face. Okay, there. I was like, maybe everyone else is seeing my face. I know I haven't done anything.
Yeah, this is for a while.
Okay.
So at this time, I would like to remind everybody, if you have questions that you would like me to pose to either Erica or Beth, to type them into the question and answer feature at the bottom. Or sometimes I think it's on the side, depending on what type of device you have. While I wait for those questions to come in, I have a couple questions for you guys. Erica, you talked about that ongoing installation that you did in your home from 2007 to 2019. That was a large scale shrine that kept you surrounded by inspirational objects. And you have referred to this space as an Eden and a sanctuary. This made me think of internal spaces that we inhabit, being our homes, our studios, and then the external spaces that we choose to exist in, our cities, our towns, etc., and how those spaces affect us emotionally, spiritually, and creatively. Has there been a particular space, and this question's for both of you, has there been a particular space that has significantly inspired or affected you in any of those ways? And how?
Erica, do you want to take that first since you're...
Sure. Definitely my garden. it's I don't know, it's hard to think. Honestly, that room was probably the place I spent the most time where I felt that way. I have to think a little bit. Beth, do you want to answer that?
Sure. I mean, I have at times really felt like I was witnessing myself experience a space. Like it was very strange, like a little bit of an out of body experience. Like I realized when I found myself in certain spaces, which were primarily outside, that I was deeply impacted by them in a way that was like almost non-verbal. Most recently, the tall grass prairie in Kansas, which we were just talking about before the webinar began. When I drove through that space in August, I literally felt my body change through that space. And I made sure on the road trip back that I had time to stop and actually get out of the car and be in that space. But that it's not always apparent what that means, until maybe months later or years later. But it is a moment that if you're observing or you're paying attention, which is our jobs as visual artists, that you understand that there's something in that you have to come back to in some way or another and address. Maybe not even in a making way, but just in a way that something's. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but when it happens, it's really powerful.
And it does happen a lot outside, or if you see some man, woman, non-binary made structure that's something that's so unimaginable. I know what you mean about the feeling your body change when you see. I'm just having a hard time imagining what that is for me, but I know what you're talking about.
Can I ask you a question, Erica, that has to do with this? So
Yeah.
I live in this area that is like ridden, and I mean that in a good way, with artist-built environments. And
Sorry, Beth, I didn't hear you. With what?
Okay, so we have a tremendous amount of artist-built environments.
Oh, artist-built, yeah. In
the Midwest, and those spaces deeply affect me as well. And they straddle this like interior, exterior, like interiority space from usually like one individual. And I'm just wondering about if you've found yourself in any of those spaces, like the Watts Towers are in California, right, obviously, but there's a lot of sites in the South as well. And I'm just wondering about your work and the relationship to those sites, if there is one.
I mean, I definitely feel that way when I go to the American Visionary Museum in Baltimore. It's this almost like overpowering feeling where it's just, it's hard to imagine where someone's brain is when they're making that work. It's a very powerful feeling. And it's like on the tip of my tongue. I don't know why I'm having a hard time thinking about which places that I felt that way in. Sorry, guys.
We do have a couple of questions that came in. So Erin Ashley writes, says, hi, thank you both for sharing so much. Because you have talked a bit about domesticity within both of your works, I'm wondering what your definitions of domesticity are.
That's a great question. I guess it's up to, I don't know, Beth, do you want to start?
I'm going to take it. Well, for me, it's very much about the home and the idea of home and the way that idea of that specific kind of interior space has changed over time. So it's not just about house per se, but this understanding of home and identity within home when I talk about domesticity, that's what and also the rituals within that home. So for me, my work is very much about kind of referring to or locating within like that kind of interior. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely about home, and and it isn't about the house. I'm always so curious what people consider home to be, and we don't just, I don't think home is all about where you live. I think that a lot of it's chosen. Yeah, I mean, it's basically about the rituals that you choose to do that make you feel a sense of home. I think that's where my head goes with that. And that could be a studio, that could be a museum, that could be a church. It's interesting because I think we all have different specific needs for what home should be, or what we need it to be for us. And maybe it's also about giving yourself the things that you didn't get in your home growing up. I'm always curious about how people define home. But yeah, domesticity equals home to me too.
It does too.
Yeah.
For me, it's like home is also identity, right? It's really, for me, it's rooted in that for me, like a lot of the work is about this collective identity. And so that's the vocabulary that can bring me there.
Right.
In a way.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Fred Call. Hi, Fred.
Hey, Fred.
Beth, your work is striking in its use of only clear, non-colored glass. Can you speak to that? I'm curious why you have consistently avoided color.
Such a Fred question.
Well, color avoids me. No, I'm just kidding. So I tend to, I find that color can be very, it can be very symbolic. Everything for me, from my perspective, is rooted in symbolism. And so when I introduce color into my work, it really is either going to be representational on some level, or it's going to be symbolic or emotive. And I basically distill all of the color from most of the work so that it inhabits a space that is more about almost posing a question for you instead of, instead of telling you what to think, it gives you a suggestion of an idea that can open into something else. And I think when you remove color, then that color, for me, color can stop your eye, and it can land objects and make them very concrete and tangible in the material. And also, color historically has been quite decorative within glass specifically. So even if you look at like my metal work, I don't really use color in that as well. I just want the color of the metal. So it's like a way of using historically decorative art processes, but like removing the ornamentation back to a more kind of elemental way of approaching making for me.
And Beth, I have a follow-up question with that. You did speak about materiality and the importance of that. And you discussed and listed some of the materials you use and how it's not just glass, it's many different things. Does that play a role also in the choice to shy away or not have as much color within the work to celebrate the actual material? Or is that something that you're not thinking necessarily, or you want to convey?
So just color for me is just, it just is another aspect of like narration. And I'm trying to create almost an ephemeral space and an elusive space. And I find that when you're given color within the work, that you're taking ownership over the work in a different way. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever that I just said. But for me, that's what it does, is it gives you more of an avenue in, like a way of relating. And I'm more interested in like removing information and only giving what is necessary within a dialogue. So very recently, the last several years, a lot of the work that I've done is really about concealing information. Actually, within like the Marston Hartley chest of drawers, all of that information is really removed from you, but there is colored objects within the cabinet, but you're only able to access them at different portals within that cabinet. So it's about what is lost or what is removed or unattainable or inaccessible. So I do use, like, I'm actually making a piece right now that has a little color in it.
I was just going to say that. You were just saying,
Yeah.
I didn't know.
Yeah. I'm finishing a piece right now that has a little color, but once again, it's like concealed behind clear glass. I really like this, like almost like a courtship of the viewer, but also an ultimate like frustration. But it also gives you room to imagine. You know, if I'm not giving you all the information, then you can, you know, it's the difference between like a book and a movie on some level, you know.
Sure.
I like movies. Don't take that the wrong way. But.
I have one final question, and it's kind of a two-part question. You both spoke of collaborative projects. Is there a project or any sort of environment that you both worked in or on together that was particularly memorable? And the second part is, are there collaborative projects that you guys have talked about for the future, just as brainstorming for the possibilities?
No, this is it. But we've spent a lot of time collaborating on it, and we've had a lot of fun talking on the phone every day for like a week and a half. It's been really a nice way to connect, but no, we haven't talked about that.
But I think we should keep talking.
Yeah, talking. We're like,
it's just been such a treat.
it's fun.
But I think the great thing about our community, right, is that there is such a, we are within this collaborative community. And while there are pairings within it, there's also a common language that we all share. So I will look forward to a future possibility of collaborating with you, Erica.
Yeah, of course, I would love that. Yeah, and it's so inherent to the culture, to the process of what we do, especially if you're a glass blower. But it's so inherent to our culture. You know, it's so back even centuries ago, the idea of apprentice and the person at the bench, and yeah, it's a big part of what we do, and it becomes part of all of our friendships too, you know.
Yeah.
Very supportive. I do have one question that just came in while you were answering that one, so I'd like to squeeze it in if we could. This comes from Marette. When starting a new body of work, do you rather trust your instincts and perhaps what might come from the collaborations, or do you purposefully nudge your practice to different directions?
Oh, I feel like both. I mean, there's always part of me that wants to nudge something in one direction, but really, I mean, we don't like to say no to anybody or each other. So you kind of just have to let go and have it be, there be this organicity to it. But of course you want it to be a certain way sometimes, but that doesn't always happen. And that's part of the beauty of it, you know?
I think for my response work, you know, as I mentioned, like there have been some pieces that have evolved through dialogue and circumstance for 5 to 7 years. And ultimately, to date, I always feel like the end result is exactly what it should be in the end. Like I've never felt regret or remorse in changing. If I knew exactly what I was going to learn at the onset of a project, I probably would not be very enthusiastic about approaching it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for everything you shared with us tonight. I greatly appreciated it. We're going to put some slides up right now. Specifically, I'd like to see the slide. Yep, there you go, with Beth and Erica's websites. So if you guys would like to learn more about Beth or Erica, please visit their websites. Again, thank you both for joining us. It's been a pleasure. And I, along with everybody else, have learned so much about your work. Marcy, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And of course, we have Pam's information up on the screen right now. And if you have any ideas of things that you'd like to hear from us in the future, please contact Pam. I just want to add one more reminder about Wheaton Conversations coming up in 2021. Keep an eye on the website, on our social media, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all and have a good evening. If you'd like a copy of the chat, then drop me a line or drop Pam a line, whichever email you happen to get. You can find more information at WheatonArts.org. Good night and thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for doing this, guys.
Welcome.